Welcome to everyone tuning in. My name is Johannes. I'm the co-founder and COO of Orange Wheel, and this is our first episode at Orange Wheel Podcast. With me today is Ted, founder and CEO.
Glad to be here with you, Johannes. Thanks a lot.
So part of what makes our podcast unique is that we keep it to 21 minutes or less. We want to be mindful of your time and energy, especially in an age where attention spans are shrinking and every pixel on your device is fighting for your attention. In this episode, we're going to be touching on a few key questions, including what is the monetary transition, why Orange Wheel was founded, how we work with companies and what makes our approach different, and where we see things heading in the next 5 years. With that, let's dive in. Ted, tell us a bit about your own background and what led you to launch Orange Wheel.
Okay, thanks a lot, Johannes. So a little bit about me. I'm a Canadian by background. I studied chemical engineering at McGill University in Montreal, and then worked in the Canadian oil and gas industry for the start of my career. I also have an MBA from INSEAD in France, and I'm a CFA charter holder. For the last 13 years or so, I've been focusing on corporate strategy and management consulting. I have experience at BCG, as well as at Maersk Oil, Maersk Drilling, and OMV, so large energy-related companies, as well as building the first strategy function at Bitpanda, which is Europe's largest crypto brokerage based in Vienna. So although I'm not European, I've been living in Europe for the past 13 years. And in parallel to my professional career, I've had a very deep fascination with monetary systems, macroeconomics, and monetary theory and history, as well as a growing conviction about the major shift underway that I'm labeling the monetary transition, which we'll get deeper into later. I believe this is the most fascinating and far-reaching shift in our lifetimes, and something that is very important to communicate and also to align to my professional life. So I've recently taken the opportunity to apply my professional skills that I've taken from a corporate strategy and consulting, and to apply it in a way that relates to the monetary transition. And ultimately founded Orange Wheel to help business leaders, particularly in Europe and Canada, to be able to make sense of what this is and to think and act strategically in response.
So the name Orange Wheel, can you tell us a bit about what's behind the name?
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, orange, for those who might not be aware, it's really the color associated with Bitcoin and the monetary transition more generally. And the wheel, there's a lot of different aspects about choosing the wheel. So first of all, it's really about movement, progression, technological revolution, really about helping to propel our clients forward in terms of their thinking, their clarity, willingness to take action. It's also a symbol of revolution. Wheels revolve in a circle, but we see this as a really indeed revolutionary technology. And furthermore, an increasing number of people within the space are comparing the invention of Bitcoin as being as profound as the invention of the wheel itself. So there's lots of different connectivity there. And I think it just sounds really cool too.
Great. So when we're talking about monetary transition, there's a lot of content out there about this specific topic. How do you see Orange Wheel's approaches is different?
Yeah, so a lot of content in the Bitcoin and macroeconomic space is kind of USA centric. And I think there's good reason for that, of course. That's the largest capital markets in the world. The US dollar is the foundation of the global monetary system right now. And that's fair. But I feel there's a dearth of content that is focused on markets outside of the US, particularly in Europe. And within Europe, it's very fragmented within each kind of member state as well. As well, we focus on the corporate audiences, and we come with a more holistic view on the monetary transition, not only looking at Bitcoin as a treasury asset exclusively as a payment mechanism or exclusively about mining, really about looking at all the potential opportunities and risks.
Okay, so when you talk about the monetary transition, what do you mean exactly? What does the history teach us about these kinds of shifts, and what drives the transition today? Why should businesses care about this, especially in Europe?
Okay, great questions. Yeah. So here at Orange Wheel, I've developed kind of an 8-point thesis that helps to explain the concept of the monetary transition as I see it. I'll preface this before we go into the 8 points, just kind of paying homage to some of the thinkers that have influenced this perspective. Clearly, some of my background in philosophy of science, thinking about Thomas Kuhn and paradigm shifts, as well as Neil Ferguson and his book, The Ascent of Money, which provides a really good historical perspective of the history of money. So with that in mind, the first point is really that money is not arbitrary and that it does indeed really matter. It's foundational to the concept of trust, value exchange, and decision-making by economic actors. There are some economic theorists that believe that money is completely arbitrary, the chartalists and others. I take a more Austrian stance, which I think has proved out in history that money itself is really important to the success of economies, and that harder monies are ultimately preferred over softer ones for a variety of reasons. And I think it's important then also to note that many companies and business leaders don't often think about money in this sense. They really just take it as something that is a point system that kind of goes up or down. And it's really about optimizing that number, but not actually thinking about what constitutes money and the fact that there are alternative monies throughout history. The second point is that money itself evolves. I think many people have heard, would understand that in the past, we relied on different types of monies, most notably gold. Gold acted as a money for thousands of years and across most human civilizations. And we have moved to now a fiat system, which has advantages and disadvantages versus gold. This system itself is not the end state. We're actually moving now into a new system. We're in the early stages of that transition, but now we're moving into a system that's moving away from fiat money, which is backed by sovereign debt effectively and trust in the governments that issue it, and moving now into a system that is based on a Bitcoin, which is very fascinating. It's linked to the physical world through the energy dedicated to the computations that secure the system. A little bit technical in nature, but ultimately it is technically superior money based on its properties. Then we have the third point. Point 3 is that the current system, the fiat system itself, is under strain and is actually in the process of unraveling. I think this is something that even people who don't understand macroeconomics and monetary theory can indeed sense. You were seeing a lot of things in the news regarding increased inflation, sovereign debt crises, trade wars, also kind of being the tip of the iceberg in relation to this. We also see in the corporate world, more specifically, the rise of zombie companies. The fact that if you look at the S&P 500 right now, it's really only 7 companies that are driving the performance. The other 493 companies in the S&P 500 are flat on average, and many of them are actually decreasing. So we have this situation where companies cannot create real economic value in the current system. And the last point I'd say is that there's a certain degree of trust eroding in the institutions, the central banks, the governments, and the trust that has been imparted on them by virtue of the fiat systems. Point 4, I think this is an important one. The transition is not a hypothetical thing. It's actually something we're living in today. We are seeing Bitcoin integrate into existing traditional financial structures, and this is ultimately necessary. It's not going to be a situation where there's like turning off the old system and turning on the new system. The capital and value has to flow from the old system into the new system, and that requires integration. And we're seeing it in many different ways. The most maybe notable examples would be the Bitcoin ETFs, providing access for retail and institutional investors to get access and exposure to Bitcoin indirectly, as well as Bitcoin treasury companies like MicroStrategy, MetaPlanet, and others. And we're also seeing, loans, bonds that are now structured with Bitcoin components. So this transition is underway already. Again, not a hypothetical future situation. Point 5. Now, even though the transition is happening and we can probably have a pretty good understanding of what the endpoint might look like under a new monetary standard, the pathway to get there is quite uncertain. I think people have different perspectives of how much time, at what rate, which vehicles will be involved, what the response from governments and regulators will be in different parts of the world. So there are a lot of variables that are uncertain in terms of how that pathway will unfold. And that's why it's important to use scenario thinking, which is also something that is important here at Orange Wheel when we work with our clients. Point 6, quite quick, just given that this is such a profound system and change, and that that money is really the base layer of any financial system, and that we're really talking about not just one country, but the global financial system. All economic actors are going to be impacted by this change. Individuals, institutional investors, corporations, and nation states as well. Point 7, this presents risks and opportunities, and that it's important to recognize that the opportunity is really most beneficial to those that recognize this transition early and respond proactively as opposed to reactively. And the last point is really that strategic readiness will be a competitive advantage. So that's really our focus, is really helping our clients understand the need for proactive strategic readiness in response to this transition, and ultimately to be able to take action with conviction. And the last point, I guess, that you brought up is like, why should European businesses care? Europe is, of course, different than the US, different political structures, different regulatory structures, definitely different culture as well. And all of these things have kind of positioned Europe to be really behind the curve vis-a-vis the US and some Asian countries, as well as more of a cultural hostility and skepticism towards the new system, much more than the US. So in order for European companies to stay competitive in a global financial markets, capitalist markets, it's really important that they do not lag further behind and actually stay up with the curve and to be able to maintain their competitiveness in whatever industry they may be in vis-a-vis international competitors.
So what I'm hearing you say is we've actually reached a point now where the traditional finance space or sector is beginning to look at this. Why do you think there's still so much misunderstanding around Bitcoin?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's for those of us who've kind of gone deep into the analysis, it seems like something that is inevitability, something that is morally good for the world that will ultimately lead to more equitable outcomes for folks and just a more fair and prosperous society as well. Now, for people who haven't really done the research, it can, of course, be something that is easily misunderstood. So I think there's a couple reasons there. First one is that, as brought up earlier, money and monetary systems are just not something that people typically think about. It's not something typically taught in school unless you're going into like a fairly, master's level academic program into monetary theory and systems and so forth. So even business leaders, they might have a good understanding of orthodox corporate finance, orthodox Keynesian economic theory, but not this kind of like deep understanding of evolutions of monetary systems. Secondly, unfortunately, Bitcoin has been heavily politicized and polarized. I think it's evoked a lot of emotional responses from the media. There's ideological baggage associated with it, and in some cases, just outright misinformation, misunderstanding, which really clouds and distorts the conversation. I think in particular as well, there's a lot of confusion amongst people about what makes Bitcoin really different from the other millions of blockchain-based crypto assets out there. And people will tend to kind of think of these as all one thing, even though Bitcoin really does have properties that make it fundamentally different, most importantly of which is its decentralized, really real decentralized nature. Third point is that maybe the communities, the early adopters in the Bitcoin space, weren't necessarily the people who spoke the same language as people who are business leaders of corporations today. They tend to be deep into the tech, maybe libertarians, and there isn't that kind of like those people who can communicate these concepts in the same sort of language as that lands well with conventional business leaders. And lastly, I'd say is just this sheer speed of change. Things are happening in this space so quickly. It's so dynamic that it's easy to fall behind in terms of where the market is at. I would say it's only in the last couple of years where the corporate adoption has really begun to take off. So if you were to kind of go to corporations even 2 or 3 years ago, there wouldn't have been the credibility, the proof of the playbook to point to show that this is not a fringe movement anymore. This is something that hundreds of companies are embarking on already, and every week new companies are joining the fray. So ultimately, this makes it such that many leaders still rely on outdated mental models and haven't developed clarity and understanding on what's really happening in the space. And I think that's fair because business leaders have to focus. They can't focus on everything. And this is just something that maybe hasn't made it on their radar, given all the other things that they might have to focus on. And lastly, I'd say that that's exactly the gap that Orange Wheel is positioning to address.
Well, I just want to add really quick as well, like when we look at history, every time there's a big shift in how things are done, there's always a lot of, it takes a lot of time for people to catch on to it.
Yeah. There's this natural inertia resistance to new things.
Yeah.
And skepticism. Yeah.
Yeah, but we're kind of reaching the point now where people are starting to pay attention to it. Okay, so how do you say how is Orange Wheel helping companies navigate this transition?
Yeah, so our mission is really to help leadership teams and directors on boards of companies to understand and see this monetary transition with clarity, to think strategically, and to act confidently and with conviction. How we do this is through a kind of a sequence of services. We provide executive educational seminars for executive teams and directors. Then we kind of move on to more strategic workshops where we look at the company's specific circumstances, looking at the industry they're in, their financial position, the health of their balance sheet, their capital structure, the nature of relationships with their suppliers and customers. And we also apply scenario planning to understand how their financial statements might evolve under different scenarios. And then the last piece we would do is implementation planning, where for companies that do want to invoke some of these strategic initiatives, we would come up with a roadmap, sequence the activities in a way that makes sense, bring in, assign responsibilities both internally and also partnering them with external service providers who can provide the right expertise, whether it be in brokerage, OTC acquisition, custody solutions, as well as things like legal, regulatory, and tax. So that's kind of our service offering. So it's really about not using only generic perspectives, but also making things very specific to each individual client's circumstances.
So what kind of leaders do we typically work with here?
Yeah, so we tend to target mid to large size companies here in Europe, Northern Europe particularly, and also in Canada as well, where I hail from. We're particularly focusing on businesses that are in mature industries, where they're suffering from limited growth opportunities, those that are, gradually seeing the value in real terms of their business decay over time, where they only have the options of, value destroying redistribution of capital to their shareholders, or very low growth or negative real growth organic investments. And I think we're seeing there's actually many, many companies in this position. If you look at kind of stock performance as an indicator, the majority of businesses on any given exchange are kind of fall into this category. And then specifically within those companies, we're looking at, the board of directors, CEOs, CFOs, corporate treasurers, heads of strategy, corporate development, and we go across all sectors. We have a particular deep expertise within the energy sector, but we do support clients across all sectors.
I mean, if we ask a Bitcoiner today, especially I guess the last year, most Bitcoiners would say that it is obvious that a lot of the corporate space is going to adopt Bitcoin in some way in the future. Some people might even say it's inevitable, right? So this is really exciting. Where's Orange Wheel going, and what can we expect from the coming years?
Yeah, great question. And I'm totally with you. I believe that Bitcoin is going to touch all companies at some point. Hard to say exactly when, but at some point, all companies will be seeking to increase their Bitcoin holdings through their operation activities and investing activities over the coming year. So I think that just speaks to the market potential, first of all, of this business. Like 99% of companies don't have any Bitcoin exposure, and in the future, 100% of the companies will need to have it. So it's very exciting. So our focus here for the coming year is really focusing on educational content. So podcasts like this, like the Orange Wheel podcast, getting the message out there, building our brand, of course, doing some thought leadership. So writing articles and providing briefings to groups of leaders at particular seminars, both from our own events that we'll set up, but also piggybacking onto existing networking events. I'd also say the space is moving very fast, as we mentioned earlier. So really following the news that's happening daily, and being able to communicate that to our audience. So, for example, just earlier today, it was announced that a French company called Sequan was raising capital, I think $350 million worth to invest in Bitcoin on their treasury, as well as applying their retained earnings that were sitting in cash into Bitcoin. So this marks maybe the 140th public company to announce such a strategy. And then also kind of taking our advisory offerings and starting to make more off-the-shelf products, whether it be for the scenarios, workshop materials, as well as financial statement forecasting tools. So starting to get those so that we can spread the tools and knowledge to a broader set of companies that might not be able to, for whatever reason, go for the consulting advisory route. Yeah. And I think ultimately, really what we're looking here is to build a community of pan-European forward-thinking leaders in the space.
Why is this critical for leaders to act on this now? And how can they connect with Orange Wheel?
Yeah. So just to kind of recap, I mean, as we said, monetary transitions don't just affect a few companies or a few industries. This is something that's going to reshape the entire economy. And as we mentioned earlier, the companies that recognize this change and respond earlier stand to benefit the most from the transition. Those that don't may not exist in the future as well, right? So it can be existential in nature depending on how this transition plays out. So I think it's really critical, if you're a leader of a business, part of the executive team, part of the board of directors, or have a senior role in finance or corporate strategy, and you're starting to kind of see or ask yourself certain questions, like how do we preserve the value that we've created? How do we allocate capital in an environment where returns struggle to outpace the inflation? And really, now that we can no longer trust things like US treasuries to be secure stores of value and safe havens, what are the new safe havens in the future going to be? Then I think those are all signals and symptoms that maybe it's time to start thinking about the bigger picture, why this is happening, and what your business might be able to do in light of a greater understanding of the transition that's underway here. So I encourage you to follow Orange Wheel on LinkedIn, look for our content, and of course, reach out if you are interested in learning more about how we might be able to help your business.
Okay, Ted, I think let's close this off for now. It was a great chat we had. We'll do this again another time.
Thanks a lot, Johannes. Looking forward to it. Bye.